The first thing you hear isn't the wind. It's the drip. A steady tapping on metal, like a quiet clock hidden in the trees. Top, top, top. That sound was my childhood, and if I close my eyes now, I can still place every bucket in the grove by sound alone. I remember thinking the forest had its own heartbeat and that in March, when winter loosened its grip, the heart remembered how to beat again. My name's Daniel. I grew up in eastern Canada, where spring is never on time and never late. She arrives exactly when the maples say she can. My grandfather used to say that the first melt isn't a date on a calendar, it's a taste on your tongue. He would step outside at dawn, breathe in the cold, and say, "It's running." He didn't explain what it was. He didn't have to. Sap is a small miracle you can hear before you see. We called our grove a sugar bush, like everyone else around here. It wasn't big, maybe 24 old maples, some so wide it would take 2 of us to hug them. At the bottom of the hill sat a squat timber building blackened by 100 steams, the sugar shack. No windows, just a door and a stovepipe pointing at heaven. The first time I saw inside, the heat kissed my cheeks and the scent, smoke, wet wood, and sweetness so thick you could hold it, sat me down like a sermon. My grandfather was not a loud man, but the sap made him talkative. He'd set the fire, stir the pan with a long-handled skimmer, glance at the thermometer like it was a compass, and start telling stories that had no beginning and no end, just loops, like the rings in the trees. Your great-granddad boiled through the blackout, he'd say. No lights, no trucks, just men and buckets and snow. Syrup tastes better when you earn it. He never said the word tradition, but you could hear it in his voice every time he said we. The year I turned 16, he put a brace and bit in my hands and said, "You tap." It felt like a knighthood. The rules were simple. Don't drill too deep, don't tap the same spot twice, honor the tree by taking only what it can spare. I walked from trunk to trunk, pressed my ear to the bark as if I might hear the sap inside, then leaned into the drill until the wood gave up a clean curl that smelled like cold sugar. The spiles went in with a satisfying push. The bucket sang. I thought it would last forever. It didn't. He got smaller the way old men do, quietly, politely. One year he walked the hill twice a day. The next year, once. The year after that, he'd sit on the bench outside the shack and say, "I'll listen for you," and I would go alone. When he passed, the grove stood exactly the same. The trees didn't wear black. The drip didn't pause. But the sound changed for me. It echoed. I moved away. Life fills with other sounds when you let it. I still came back each spring, but I learned to time my visits like appointments. A weekend here, a long weekend there, help my dad lay the fire, boil a batch, hug, promise to call, and leave. The buckets kept time without me. The shack breathed without me. I told myself that was the point. Traditions don't need you, you need them. This story begins on the last morning I thought I could keep it all going alone. Late March, a pale sun and a crust of snow, crunchy before noon and slushy by 2. My hands remembered the taps before my head could. Muscle memory is half of what we call heritage. I set the spiles, hung the buckets, and by midday the sap was singing. 30 buckets, each chiming its small note. I hauled the first runs down to the shack in a pair of old plastic sleds that had more scars than I do. I set the fire, and the shack exhaled that familiar breath, smoke and sweetness and steam that fogged my glasses and my plan for the rest of my life. People think you make syrup by boiling sap. That's true, but it's not the whole truth. You make syrup by deciding what you're willing to give up. 40 liters of sap becomes 1 liter of syrup, which means the rest becomes air, heat, memory. It's an act of surrender. You stand there feeding wood into the arch, skimming foam, watching the temperature creep from 90-something to 100-something, and the hours slide into each other until time feels like it's reduced. 2. Around mid-afternoon, I stepped outside for cool air and heard tires on gravel. A car door slammed. Footsteps. Then a voice that was both familiar and misplaced here. Dan. I turned. It was Maya, my cousin on my mother's side, the kind of cousin you love like a sibling for half your childhood and then lose to distance and adult schedules. I hadn't seen her in years. She wore a city coat and boots that didn't deserve this mud, but her smile fit the place. I was in town, she said. Thought I'd see if the shack remembered me. It remembers everyone who smells like pancakes, I said, and she laughed the way she used to, which put something back into the day I hadn't realized was missing. We stepped inside. The steam wrapped around us like a welcome. I handed her the skimmer and she worked the surface like she'd never left. We stood side by side for a long time saying nothing. That's the thing about places that raised you. You don't need to narrate them. When the boil hit that soft rolling point, the shack felt like a cathedral. The tin roof pinged. The fire cracked. The thermometer hovered just shy of magic. And that's when the middle of the story reached up and tugged my sleeve. The door opened and a gust of cold came with a girl I'd never met. 15, maybe 16. Dark hair, nervous shoulders, a backpack with patches from bands I only recognized by rumor. She blinked at the steam, read our faces like a test she hadn't studied for, and said, "Is this where you make the syrup?" Maya and I traded a glance. "Depends," I said. "Are you a critic?" She didn't smile. "I'm supposed to interview someone about a tradition for school. My mom said the boy from the old maple place might be here." She shrugged half an apology. "Im nova." "Like the star?" I asked. "Like the car," she said, and I absolved her of the quiz. Maya led her closer to the pan, explained the reduction, the thermometer's fuzzy honesty, the way a drop off a spoon sheets when it's ready. I watched Nova's face as she watched the boil. Something in her softened, the way city faces do when they remember that the world existed before Wi-Fi. "Why do you do it?" she asked finally, looking at me. I opened my mouth to say what I always say, because it tastes better, because it's our thing, because if we don't, the Grove will forget our names, but I stopped. The truth had grown. I felt the shape of it and knew I had to tell it whole or not at all. "Because it teaches me how to lose," I said. "How to trade quantity for quality. How to stay when it gets boring. How to listen to something that doesn't use words. And because my grandfather's hands are in these boards and my father's breath is in this steam and leaving would feel like throwing a family portrait into a snowbank." Nova looked at the floor, at the pan, at me. "That's a lot," she said, but she said it softly, like a thank you. We were close to draw-off when the wind changed. A sudden hard shove rattled the stovepipe and sent smoke burping back into the shack. The flame spiked. The boil surged. In a heartbeat, the pan we'd watched all day took charge of us. Anyone who's boiled knows this moment, when syrup decides it will be syrup now and to argue is to burn dinner and your grandfather's good name. "Dampers," I said. "Open the door. Maya, hold the skimmer. Nova, grab the bucket." We moved like we'd rehearsed 100 times though we hadn't rehearsed at all. Another definition of family. I opened the drawer-off and the first amber thread slid into the pail like liquid sunlight. The shack filled with that smell you never forget, sweetness with a shadow, caramel with a memory. Nova closed her eyes like she was trying to photograph it with more than eyes. When the last run finished, we stood there steaming with the shack. Outside, the light had gone blue. The grove creaked the way trees do when temperature drops, a sound like polite bones. I poured a little of the hot syrup into 3 tin cups and we burned our tongues grinning. "Better than the store," Nova said, blinking tears for reasons that had nothing to do with heat. "Store syrup is a postcard," Maya said. "This is a letter." The 3 of us stepped outside into evening. The buckets tapped in the quiet. Somewhere down the hill a fox barked once and then thought better of it. I felt the way you feel in a church after the hymn when everyone is still holding their breath. "You'll do this next year?" Nova asked. It was 1 part question and 1 part plea. I started to say yes. I wanted to say yes. But honesty had climbed into the shack with the wind and it hadn't left. My life in the city was louder than the Grove now. Work had me on a leash. The drive got longer every year. "I don't know," I said. "I want to. But wanting isn't always enough." Nova looked at the buckets, the shack, the trees that had learned our names and our silence. "Then teach someone," she said. Maya elbowed me like she used to when we were 10 and she wanted me to jump from the dock first. She's right. We went back inside and drew a small map on the back of a feed sack. Where to find the drill. How to set the spiles without bruising the bark. Which trees are stingy and which are generous. How to read the temperature when the thermometer lies by a degree. The number for Mr. Halpin down the road who will trade you wood for overboiled syrup because his grandkids don't notice. By the time we were done, the pails had cooled to a good maple 70-something degrees and the shack was a soft dark. I carried the jars to the kitchen in the house where the walls still smell like my grandparents' laundry soap. We poured, sealed, labeled. The labels said first boil in a hand that is not as steady as it once was and more honest than it has ever been. Nova took 1 jar for her mom and 1 for her teacher and promised to come back Saturday to help pull buckets. She left a voice note on her phone to remind herself what draw-off looks like. Before she went, she pulled a small pin from her backpack, a star with a cracked enamel point, and set it on the windowsill above the sink. "In case you need a new north," she said. After she left, Maya and I sat at the table with our elbows in our memories. "You remember when Uncle Joe burned a whole pan and pretended it was deliberate because he called it maple toffee?" she said. "And everyone believed him because he said it loud enough," I said. We laughed until the sadness had somewhere to sit that wasn't the middle of the room. When she drove away, I wandered back to the shack alone. The moon had come out, thin and brave. Steam still unspooled from the roof in a silver ribbon. I opened the door and stood in the doorway like a man deciding if he lives here or only visits. I thought about endings. How we treat them like walls when they are more often doorways. How we keep traditions in boxes marked fragile and forget they were born to be used and nicked and fixed and shared. My grandfather never taught me to make syrup so I could guard it like a dragon. He taught me so the trees would have someone to talk to. Inside, on the bench where he used to sit, I found the old brace and bit. The wood was polished by 1,000 ungloved mornings. I held it and felt the way you feel when you hold a hand that once held yours. I put it back. The next day, Nova returned with a notebook, a thermos, and a pair of cheap gloves she refused to remove because they had tiny stars on them. She tapped her first tree like she was asking permission. She missed the angle the first time and apologized to the bark. The second time, she got it right. The bucket sang. You could see it in her shoulders, the click of belonging. "Don't worry if you mess up," I told her. "The trees are patient. They've seen worse." We walked the hill together, and I listened as the grove learned her footsteps. By noon, my head had made a decision my mouth was still working up to. Traditions don't live because one person refuses to die. They live because someone younger finds a reason to show up in the cold and drill a careful inch into something older than any of us. I wrote a list that afternoon and pasted it to the inside of the shack door. Tap late. Pull early. Thank the tree. Use dry wood. Stir gentle. Never boil angry. Share jars with neighbors. Teach somebody. Let the last one go. The last line surprised me. I don't remember planning to write it. But as soon as I saw it there, I knew it was mine. Let the last one go. The teaching is the keeping. The keeping is the letting go. On my last evening before driving back to the city, I walked to the far tree, the one with the lightning scar and the stubborn bark that likes to spit the spile out if you tap too shallow. I removed the bucket, patted the trunk like the shoulder of an old friend, and whispered, "Thank you." I don't know who I was thanking, my grandfather, the tree, the part of myself that still remembers quiet, but I meant it. When I reached the shack, Nova was waiting with 2 tins of cookies her mother had sent and a question in her eyes I recognized from every first spring I ever had. "Will you be here next weekend?" she asked. "I won't," I said. Honesty, this time, didn't hurt. It set something down. "But you will." She nodded. "I will." "Call me if the fire gets bossy," I said. "And when the syrup sheets off the spoon, don't panic. You've got 5 seconds to be brave. That's all this ever is." She smiled. "I'll be brave for 6. We stood together at the door and looked in at the pan, at the place where water becomes something else because someone stays long enough to listen. The shack didn't look empty to me anymore. It looked ready. If you've made it this far with me, if you can hear the buckets in your head and smell the steam in your hands, then you know this isn't just a story about syrup. It's about the math of meaning. 40 parts patience, 1 part sweetness, and the piece you don't measure, the part you hand to someone else. If this reminded you of your own family's small ritual, baking on Sundays, fixing nets at dusk, singing the same song every winter, share this video with them. Traditions stay alive when we pass them like warm jars across a table. And if you want more stories like this, real work, real seasons, real people, subscribe. That's what we do here. We keep the quiet things from being forgotten. As I drove away, the last thing I saw in the rearview was the edge of the shack and a thin twist of steam wearing the moon like a ring. For the first time since my grandfather left, I didn't feel like I was abandoning something. I felt like I had finally done what the trees had been asking me to do all along. I let the last one go. And the grove was not empty. It was full of someone else's first.